I have published over 300 academic articles, various academic outputs, and also for a very long time I have been an editor and associate editor of various journals. So I'm associate editor of an international journal called Transcultural Psychiatry, another journal which is also an international journal called International Journal of Disability Development and Education. And I'm outgoing editor-in-chief of the African Journal of Disability. So I've done a lot of editing work. So I'm the person on the other side, the person everybody hates. And I've also reviewed lots and lots and lots of people's manuscripts that they've sent for publishing. So, and I have also had, as you will learn, so many rejection letters you can't believe it, and I continue to have those. So, but we'll talk about that. So I'm really happy to be here. And one of the things that I do now that I am getting older in my years, you might have noticed, is I'm trying to really work on upskilling the next generation, because we can't just have old people like me publishing, which is actually part of a pattern that's happening internationally in publishing. What we have with academic publishing and publishing in peer-reviewed academic journals are lots and lots and lots of people like you and me who, for their jobs and their careers, are needing to publish in academic journals. Are you under pressure in terms of your departments and the university requirements and so on? You are. Okay? And you sometimes feel a little bit upset about that pressure. You do. Yeah. Okay, so you like academics all over the world. Okay, so there's lots and lots and lots of people trying to get their stuff into these journals. Now, how do the journals decide who they're going to accept and who they're not going to accept? What they do is it goes to the editor of the journal, and the editor of the journal usually does a quick screen, and depending on the journal, it might be more or less stringent. Does this fit in with our journal? Does it have a chance of being published? If the journal believes that it's got a chance, the journal sends it on to reviewers, and we'll talk more about who the reviewers are. But to peer reviewers, people who've worked in a similar area to you. And it's generally anonymous. It's not so with all journals anymore, so none of the BMC journals. It's usually anonymous. So you take your name off, and your article then goes to 2 or 3 people. It's usually more, but by the time the editor needs to get 2 or 3 reports in, who will then make a comment on your article, and you'll get feedback. And your feedback, the most common feedback is rejection. That is the most common response. That the journal will not accept your paper, and there's nothing you can do to change it. That's the most common. Okay, and we'll talk about that. And that's the case with everyone. So lots of journals have a 95% rejection rate. Which means of every 100 articles that get sent to them, only 5 will get past that first hurdle. So 95% rejection rate with some. It's different with different journals, but the most common response is rejection, and rejection doesn't feel so good. Having experienced a lot of rejection myself. Okay, then the most unusual. Absolutely the most unusual is you send something in and the journal says, we love it, we're going to publish it. That almost never, ever happens. Almost never. It does happen. It happened to one of my PhD students, and I thought, I'm never speaking to her again, because it never happens to me. But that's very rare. And then there's a small number, which is more common than acceptance, of revise and resubmit, where you get feedback and they say, change this, change that. We don't guarantee, we don't like it, but you can give it another go, and we'll talk about that. So that's generally how the system works. Unless, and we'll talk about this right at the end, you send it to what is called a predatory journal, which is not a proper journal at all, and we'll talk about that. one of the issues around publishing is it feels so incredibly lonely. You're sort of on your own, sitting in your room, wherever you're sitting, and trying to write. Okay, so one of the things, who's doing PhDs? Just remind me, just put up your hands. You know what the art of the PhD is? Anybody who's done a PhD in the past will know that the art of a PhD is applying the seat of the pants to the seat of the chair. It's amazing how hard it is to apply the seat of the pants to the seat of the chair. So similar with writing. But what we tend not to think about with writing is the broader politics of writing, and why, certainly for me, these kinds of workshops are so incredibly important because of where we are situated as African people in the world. Now, I'm situated differently from you. I'm from South Africa, I'm white and so on, but I'm not part of the global north where most of the publishing is happening. Okay, just for your teaching and so on, there's a fun site on the internet, and you can use these, and you might have seen some of them, called World Mapper. Have any of you used worldmapper.org? You know, it's quite fun, and I'll show you how it works. Okay, so World Mapper distorts a map of the world according to, some of you will have seen this, I'm sure, according to big issues. So that's generally what the world map looks like. We know that there's all sorts of problems with that, but you recognize that map. That's a map you saw in school. Okay. You know where Africa is? Okay. Do you know where Australia? Keep your eyes on Australia. Look how big Australia is, and look where it is, because Australia, for our purposes, is very important. The Australians have put a lot of resources into helping people become better researchers and write more. So just let's see. So now we're going to look at some big social issues that are of interest to people in Africa. And I just sort of chose them. I mean, there's a whole lot of these that you can get. Okay, so this is HIV prevalence. So what happens to Africa? It bulges. So where is the most HIV in the world? Can everybody see? It's in Africa, a lot in India. Australia's disappeared. There's hardly any Europe, much less in the Americas, because where is HIV? We know where HIV is. It's with us. Okay, so this is where the big problem is of HIV. Where are the illiterate young women in the world? A very important indicator in the light of the Sustainable Development Goals, female empowerment and female literacy. Africa and Asia. Australia is gone. You see, there's no Australia here because there's very high literacy rates amongst women in Australia, and very little happening in Europe and the Americas. Okay? Now we're going to look at another indicator. This is where science research is happening. What's happened to Africa? Africa's gone. Look who's back. Australia. There was no Australia. Australia's back. Where are the big bulges? It's North America, Europe, Australia, and to some extent China, and those countries are coming up. These are quite old, and I'm sort of cheating with the data and so on, but it's just to give you a sense of things. Okay? Another one, research and development, very similar. Suddenly Europe is enormous. Africa's hardly there. And Australia's back, North America, and so on. So we're in a situation as African scholars, welcome. We're in a situation as African scholars where the big issues of the world are actually where we are, the things that we need to know about. But the knowledge that we have comes from the north. And many of you are teachers, and you're all students. I'm sure you've experienced what I experienced. You read these textbooks in sociology, or I don't know, in economics, but certainly in sociology and psychology and so on. And they describe a world which doesn't look like the world that we live in. It's different. So in psychology, they talk about the family, and what's a family? It's a mother and a father and 2 children living in Europe. Well, you know, families in Africa aren't like that. I mean, I don't know about in South Africa, more children are born to single women than to women who have partners, for example. We have extended family structures and so on. That's not reflected in the psychology literature, generally speaking. So what do we know about human development is very skewed, actually. So who's going to change that? If we sit and wait for the people in the north to change that knowledge for us, we're going to wait a long time. They're not going to change it. It's up to us. So we have the issue of publishing What we know about our context is part of our global responsibility. Nobody is sitting waiting. There's nobody in the North who's an academic who's saying, I'm going to stop publishing because I'm waiting for people in Africa to publish. So all the examples that I'm going to show you in this presentation are real examples that I've taken from people's experience. So I'm starting off with some feedback that people have got on articles which were submitted for publication. The first one reads, in summary, this article adds nothing to knowledge. Second one is, I can't see why the author bothered. And a particular one, for us in Africa, the author is clearly not English speaking and needs remedial help in English before he or she should think of publishing in academic journals. Now, if you were to get any of those responses, how would you, tell me how you'd feel? I'm a psychologist, I want to know about your feelings. How would you feel? Demoralized. Sorry? What do you say? Sometimes? Has that happened to you sometimes? Yeah.
Not specific.
No, not as bad as that, but you know that feeling. Who would be delighted to get this and run out and tell all their friends? Not me. Okay. What would you want to do if you got feedback like this? What did you say? Just say that loud. I want everybody to hear. Never try again. Because it's horrible. You get demoralized. Who wants to think, I can't see why the author bothered? It adds nothing to knowledge. You think, I'll go and do something else. I'm never going to do this again. What I think is really, really important about this is that when you see comments like this, there's a fight or flight. You're talking about the flight. Never publish again. I mean, everybody who's an academic, do you know about imposter syndrome? There's no academic on earth who does not feel like a fraud. You know, somebody at last has found out how stupid I am. You know that? It happens to me all the time. Okay? So you want to run away. And then what some people say is, I'd like to find them and kill them. I'm going to hunt them down. Okay. But as you say, so these are common and normal reactions. There would be something wrong with you if you didn't feel horrible if you got that kind of response. But we have to deal with it. I'm sort of full of stories. I had a colleague from, older man in his 70s already, from California visit our department. And he'd published 5 books in his career. And it was the old days when you could get he was in a good university, where you could get a job without journal articles. And I said to him, You've written 5 books. Why have you not published any journal articles? And he said, oh, journals don't like me. So I said, what do you mean journals don't like you? He said, no, I sent something to a journal. They were so rude, so journals don't like me. When did you send it? 45 years ago. But I mean, he never did it again. And the number of people who just stop is staggering and astonishing because of how we feel about these things. And because often we experience it individually. And part of what you need to understand is that this is what most people get. So you know all of those comments? They were all on things that I sent to journals. So I've added nothing to knowledge. They can't see why I bother. I spend my life, I'm first language English. I mean, this one like cuts me to the quick. You know, I spend my life trying to help other people. I'm first language English, and I spend my life helping other people to write in English. But I'm clearly not English speaking, and I need some remedial help in English. With all of them, I sent them to other journals. They've all been published. And in fact, the first 2, which is particularly why I chose those, the one that adds nothing to knowledge, and where they can't see why the author bothered, are 2 of my most highly cited publications in my whole career. So somebody likes me. But it's horrible. But we have to be like you. We have to get past it. There are no set accepted guidelines as to how to be a reviewer. And I have certainly, as an editor, it's very difficult when you're an editor, seen some very destructive reviews. And there are ways, you know, I'm sure you all know, you've all been students, and many of you have taught students. There are ways of giving the same feedback in such a way as to make something better, and there are ways of giving feedback as to making somebody feel so humiliated that you interfere with their learning. And I think that's behind your point. And you're absolutely right. So one of the things that's going to happen to all of you, and I'm sure it's happened to some of you already, is you're going to be that peer reviewer. And you're going to see things, and you're going to think, I can't see why the author bothered. That's what you're going to think. The strange thing, I can just tell you anecdotally, as a journal editor, I've been a journal editor, working in an editorial capacity as an associate editor and editor for about 30 years. Generally speaking, the reviewers, and the authors often don't see who the reviewers are because it's anonymous. The reviewers who are kinder and nicer are the people who are more famous, more highly published, big name. And the people who are, and if you think about it, you can think about why. The people who are less nice are the people who have got something to prove. So, I mean, I was reviewing something. I was a reviewer for The Lancet, and The Lancet, you'll know the medical scientist here will know it's the top medical journal. Everyone's heard about The Lancet. And I got this thing to review. It was brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And I couldn't think of how to make it better. And I thought, oh my goodness, they're going to think I'm such a fool as a reviewer. I must find something wrong with this. And eventually I gave up. I thought, well, it's just too bad. I can't find anything wrong with this. But that pressure in me to find something wrong, because I've got to convince the Lancet that I'm clever as a reviewer. Luckily, the story ends well. I sent it and I said, this is fantastic. It doesn't need any changes. And the two other reviewers both also said that. So it would have looked very stupid if I'd started picking. But that question of the ethics of reviews is a very useful and important one. The reason academics read is for our own writing and our own research. So we read in order to facilitate our own writing and our own research, not to find out whether the author is a genius. Do you care? With some of them, you probably can't even remember the name of the author. Do you care? You don't care who they are. Can you remember? You probably can't. You'd have to look it up. But I read this interesting article, and I can't even remember where it was from. But yeah, so we are reading to facilitate our own writing, not, and this is one of the biggest myths of academic publishing. Not because we want to find something that is completely brilliant, not because we want to discover a genius we didn't know about, and not because we want to see something that's completely original. We're actually reading in order to take our own research forward, and that has certain implications, and I'll tell you why. Peter Collett used to be the editor of a very good journal called the Journal for the Theory of Social Behavior. And it's a really complicated journal. And he made a joke, but a very useful joke that's useful for us as writers. He said, a good journal article has one idea and preferably fewer. Now, we don't want a journal article to have no ideas. But one of the big issues in academic publishing is that people try to, particularly if you're inexperienced, is trying to say too much in an article. So your question always is, what is my one idea? Do you know the PhD test? Okay, when you finish your PhD or you've written an article, you should be able to get into a lift with a complete stranger and they should be able to say to you, what's your PhD about? And the lift should go up 5 floors and you should have been able to explain it in that time. Similar with an article. What is this article about? And that's often quite difficult, and we'll talk about this, when you're taking, for example, something from a thesis, or you've done this huge study. People aren't interested in your huge study. They want to know what is the one thing that this article is about. And then when I was at school, I had to read a book called The Hidden Persuaders, which was written in the 1960s. And this is a book about advertising. And he was interested in how do advertisers get people to buy products. And he was particularly interested in how you get people to buy beauty products. I always say this sounds terribly gendered, but there are now so many beauty magazines for men. I mean, like Men's Health and Muscle and Fitness and so on. And it's all about making yourself look more attractive and so on and so forth. If you're trying to sell a beauty product to someone, and you say to that person, you are the ugliest thing I've ever seen, and you need to get my lovely lipstick, and it might make you look a bit better. Are they going to buy? They're not going to buy. Okay, so you don't position your author as in a bad way. Okay. Similarly, and we found this as well. I mean, have any of you worked in HIV prevention? But I mean, one of the big lessons of HIV prevention was, how did we start off in HIV prevention? We said to everyone, you're going to die. You're going to die, so practice safer sex. Did it work? Doesn't work. So how do you do it? And have a look, just have a look at magazines and television and billboards and so on. What they will often do is they'll position the consumer in a particular way, and it'll go like this. You always knew that in order to be beautiful, you must do such and such and such and such. But with our product, with added so-and-so, you're going to be even more adorable. Does that tune sound familiar to you? You always knew, etc. That is how we set up an academic article. You start where your reader is. You do not tell them how clever you are. You do not undermine them. You say, this is what we already know, and this is this little teeny bit extra that I can give to you. You understand what I'm saying? Okay, so the really important thing, and it's a transition often from being a student to being an academic writer, is this question of audience. Often when you're a student, all you're thinking about is, first of all, you often know who's going to mark your stuff, and you've got to convince an examiner of something. Here it's different, because you've got this reader. You've somehow got to take your reader with you. You've got to structure your work, and a lot of what I'm going to be saying is about structuring your work. Structure your work in such a way that it's going to be easy for your reader to go with you. You've got to take your reader firmly by the hand through your argument. And I just want to mention that there is a relationship between the word author, you are the author of the article, and the word authority. I hadn't thought about that before until somebody pointed it out to me. You are the authority on your article. You are in charge of that argument. I work a lot with laboratory scientists, microbiologists, and clinicians and so on, and we do the social science. So we look at community participation, community engagement, because I'm a psychologist. So we go to these conferences, and there are people there from a range of disciplines, and you sit listening to talks in fields that you actually know very little about. And so I was sitting next to a microbiologist friend at a meeting, and there were 3 presentations on the laboratory science for HIV vaccine research. And I turned to her afterwards and I said, the first presentation was okay. The second one, the science was terrible. They're terrible scientists. The third group, they're really excellent scientists. And my friend, the microbiologist, said, Leslie, you understand microbiology. You're so brilliant. Whether I'm brilliant or not is a separate question. But I didn't understand a word. What I understood was I could see who had a better structure to their argument. I could hear the music of the argument. And that's what we need to get in right. I could see that the first one was all over the place, second one was okay, and the second was the last one was a really well-organized argument. So there's a relationship between the structure of your argument and the quality of your argument. Structure to your argument is very, very important. You have just told me that the reason you read is why? In order to write. Not because you're interested in attending to what this person has to say, but no, is this useful for me? Is it on what I want? Is it, maybe I must look at something else. Am I wasting my time because we're too busy, we're too distracted, and so on. And I'm the absolute worst as far as academic attention. I have it incredibly badly, okay, which is partly why I'm so productive. So part of what we have to do when we are writing an academic article is we have to organize the experience of the person reading the article. We've got to take them by the hand and make it easy for them to read. We've got to say, this is where we're going today. So partly what we're doing as we're structuring our argument, we're both telling our audience what is included. So this is your literature review. What is included and what is excluded. So you can have 2 articles using exactly the same literature, but with different literature reviews. Because a literature review is not just saying, and have you ever done this or seen it? Unfortunately, there are many badly written academic articles. This one said that one said that, this one said that one said that, this one said that. That's not a literature review. That's what I call vomit, actually. It's just saying this one said, this one said. You've lost your authority as the author, and you've lost your audience. So you will start from where your reader is, most generally, and you will narrow down, and essentially what you do is you go from your broad introduction, narrowing down to, in the middle, your method, then your results, and I'll show you exactly how this works in a second. And then you'll take your reader by the hand again, and you'll tell them what the implications are of this for them as a reader of that journal. Okay, so it's all about structure and signposting and making it as easy as possible for your reader to read. Okay, so I want to give you an example. This is a real example from a friend of mine who did a PhD many years ago. And she asked me to help her with the PhD. And the PhD had something to do with aging. And the first chapter was on the biology of aging, and the second chapter was on the psychology of aging, and the third chapter was on the sociology of aging. Then she got to her methods, results, and conclusions. Okay, I find that the topic of aging, I don't know why, but it's getting more and more interesting to me as I get... Anyway, but can any of you guess, particularly those of you who are writing PhDs now, can any of you guess what her research question was from that? Can you? Any idea? You can't, can you? I mean, there's no... How do you know? Because it's a big chunk, it's a slab of information. This is what we know about the biology of aging. This is what we know about the psychology. This is what... It's not organized, okay? Do you want to hear what the study was actually about? The study was actually a fascinating study. She was interested in dementias, Alzheimer's, and so on. And I don't know, those of you who are interested in the next big African epidemic, it's dementias. It's a very, very serious public health problem, and it's completely understudied in low and middle income countries. Anyway, so she was interested in dementia. And what had happened was that in Cape Town, they had opened up a very expensive to run, high-tech center for people with dementia. And she was interested in a very simple question. Why do some people end up in a center where there's psychiatrists and psychologists and there's very high level of care? And other people with dementia, you know what dementia is? It's a degenerative brain disorder. Other people with dementia end up in other low care institutions or being looked after at home. Interesting question. Any ideas what might have differentiated those two groups? So the social scientists always say, what do you mean by resources? Yeah? Income. So maybe who would have been in terms of income level, who would have been in the high care facility? The richer ones. Okay, that's one possibility. Yeah, good. Anything else? Could it possibly be that people who were more ill? It's interesting when I do this talk with medical people, they say, oh, the ones who were more sick. The ones who had more symptoms. It's fascinating. What's your disciplinary background? Oh, there we go. So, spoken like this. My friend is a social worker, actually. Yeah, spoken like a social worker. I'm proud to know you. Okay, so I was doing this in the Department of Medicine at another university, and they were saying, "Oh, it must be the sicker ones." It's another hypothesis that if you're really, really sick, you end up with more and more care. Okay. Any other possibilities? Yeah.
Could also be those who are well connected. and might not necessarily be rich, but if they know people who are
Yeah. If there are social connections, so maybe they know people, they can get in there, and so on. In fact, what she found was very interesting. And I mean, you're on the scent in a way. In fact, even if you control for resources for equally well-off groups, okay, so you've got people with equal resources. That social connection thing's interesting. I haven't never had anybody talking about that, but I'm sure it's an issue often in these kinds of things. What she found was very simple. People who had daughters were far less likely to be in a high care institution. They were far more likely to be cared for at home, to be looked after by their daughters, than people who did not have daughters. Isn't that fascinating? Can you see that if she had reorganized her introduction to take the reader through, yes, the biology of aging remains important to her question, the psychology of aging remains important to her question, as does the sociology of aging, which is what you guys were pointing to. But if she'd organized it, then that would have been a proper literature review. And by the time the person turned the page to get to her research question, they should have been able to anticipate what it was. So your reader should know. Doesn't mean that those things are not relevant, but it's a way in which you organize. You're in charge of the story. You have to know who your audience is. You're involved in a conversation with other academics. You're not just putting something out there to say, look at me, I'm brilliant. Nobody cares. And then they don't know you anyway. But you're part of this conversation. So if you want to take your reader with you, you have to have some idea of who your reader is. Okay. So let's think of an example just here in this group about somebody who's trying to write something or thinking of writing something. We have your example, maybe somebody else, somebody trying to write something at the moment. Someone over here was. Okay. So we've got something about non-communicable diseases, something about old people, something about Ghana, and something about nutrition, right? Okay, right. So now, when you write, there are journals on all four of those things. There are journals that are about nutrition, which are read. Who reads nutrition journals? Do motor mechanics read nutrition journals? Well, maybe some, but I mean, who reads nutrition journals? People are interested in nutrition. No? Okay, then there might be journals on non-communicable diseases. Then there are journals that are specifically about, like Journal of Aging, I happen to know because I'm publishing on Hope. I've seen something for publication there. And then there's the particular area study, which is Ghana. Okay. So depending on who your audience is, your double funnel is going to start in a different place because you've got to start where the readership of that journal is. So I can give you an example. I'm editor of the African Journal of Disability, and I got a submission recently, and it started off, I had 5 pages on the following. Africa is a continent with 53 countries. There are varied climates. This is what the rainfall is like. And this is what the economies are, blah, blah. 5 pages on that. And after that, I got 3 pages on this is what disability is, and these are the various definitions, and blah, 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 blah. This was a submission. Do you think that the readership of the African Journal of Disability probably knows where Africa is? Probably do. They might have heard of something around disability, might they not? So you're in the wrong place for your audience. If, on the other hand, you're writing a thing about disability in Ghana for an American journal, unfortunately, there are many Americans who don't know much about Ghana. They think it's right there next to Vietnam. Okay, so you might have to do a little bit of explaining to that readership at some point where Ghana is and what the age structure is and so on and so forth. So for you, you've got to think about okay, who am I speaking to? Okay, and if you go for an international journal on non-communicable diseases, the readership will know something because nutrition is such an issue in non-communicable. They'll know something about nutrition, but they might not know the level of detail that a nutritionist would know. But they might not know that much about Ghana and the elderly. So you've got to structure your article to where your readers are. Do you see what I mean? So when I work a lot with less experienced authors, and we sit down at the computer together, and we get ready to write, and then they can't believe it because I could spend an hour or an hour and a half simply looking for journals and to what is the right audience and who am I speaking to. And I hope that we're going to have time, probably tomorrow, we will use some examples and actually do that together. Because it's doing your sort of market research is such an important part of the process, and people don't do it. They think, oh, I'll just send this here, I'll send it there. And so because people have different interests. So you do not, I mean, recently, there was some work in my department on dementia in Africa. If you want to publish an article on dementia in Africa in the journal called Dementia, you do not spend 3 pages explaining to the readership of the journal Dementia what dementia is. But if you want to publish it in African Affairs Journal or the Journal of Southern African Studies, unfortunately, a lot of your readership will not have a clue what dementia is. You've got to explain to them. But if you're publishing in Dementia, who's reading? You look at the editorial board and they're all in North America. They won't know a lot about the age. They'll think, no, they're now old people in Africa. They're all dead. You know, sorry, but you know what I mean. You've got to explain these sorts of things and the particular issues around dementia and care in Africa because of HIV and the missing middle generation and so on and so forth that people might not know about. Okay, so there are various sneaky ways that you can do this. It is very, very important if you are publishing in a journal to look really carefully at a number of things. What are the aims and scope of the journal as written by the journal? And what are the instructions for authors? You look really, really, really carefully at that. What kind of things do they accept? What kind of things don't they accept? And so on. You never leave that part out. Okay? How many words can it be, etc., etc. What's the convention of this journal? But then you have access here to online journals and online databases through your library. So it's very different from the old days when things had to be kind of sent by post and so on. What's always helpful as well is to look what's absolutely the most current thing in the journal. So they will often have an online first that doesn't even have a volume number yet. You know what I'm talking about? I could show you tomorrow if you want. But what is the most recent thing that's being published in the journal? And I'm interested in nutrition and non-communicable diseases in the elderly in Ghana, and I go to the Journal of Non-Communicable Diseases and blow me down. Last week, they've just put something on their website about the elderly and non-communicable diseases and nutrition in Japan, which is a very rich country and a completely different. I will use that article to say, you always knew. Recently, this is what we know about nutrition. It's largely from richer countries. Look, there's this recent thing from Japan. Isn't it interesting? This is what they eat in Japan, blah, 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 blah. But you didn't know that in low-income countries, the pattern of nutrition is different. People are poorer. They eat different things, and so on and so forth. I'm going to give you that little bit extra so that you're not just thinking about Japan and other rich countries. You're thinking more globally. There's the you always knew, and I'm giving you this extra thing. So you hook what you're doing to the to the things that are already in the journal. It also makes sense. I'm a journal editor. When I get something sent to me, and I am managing a journal, who am I going to choose as my reviewers? Well, who am I going to choose? I'm going to look at the people that you cite. But I'm also likely to think, oh, yeah, no, we had something like that last week in the journal. There's a peer reviewer, somebody doing a similar thing. So it's quite likely that those people will be the people who are reading your work. So you've got to make that judgment of where your reader is. Does that make sense to you? Yeah. And you do not take your reader with you by telling them how stupid they are. Because what do we all suffer from? Imposter syndrome. We don't want to hear it. We tell ourselves enough. So even your reviewers are sitting there thinking, am I good enough? Okay, so you can disagree. That's absolutely fine. You can show the limitations, and we're often, as African authors, in this fantastic position, because it's the International Journal of this and the World Journal of that, and then you look, who's international and who's the world? North America, Europe, and Australia. So you can shame them a bit into saying, look, this is where you are. You know, all of these wonderful things about nutrition and the elderly, blah, blah, blah. But they're all coming from rich countries. Well, sorry, folks, most people in the world don't live in countries like that, and they don't eat like that. Generally speaking, my view is do not undersell yourself. There is nothing wrong for going for the best possible journal in your field. What's the worst they can say? No. And most people say no anyway. And often they say no quickly. And often they say no helpfully, because you get really good quality reviewers. Don't be shy to go for the best journal. Can I tell you, I mean, my whole life is a revenge against people who were horrible to me when I was young. I'm standing here because I was cheeky and I wasn't modest, and I'll explain to you why. I wouldn't be standing here today. When I was in my 20s, it was still during the apartheid era in South Africa, and I was working in a psychiatry research unit in Cape Town. Who's been to Cape Town? You've been to Cape Town. Okay, beautiful but very divided city still. Anyway, so I was working in Cape Town, and I gave a talk in the Department of Psychiatry where I was working on an interesting thing. And the interesting thing was that internationally, people were saying that in the mental health field, if you want to treat people properly in terms of mental health and psychology and psychiatry, you have to take account of their cultural context. You've got to be sensitive to the fact that people use a range of healers and so on and so forth. So for those of you, do any of you know Lily Proby? I mean, she's a student from here who's working with me. She's been working with the shrine priests and mullams, and you know that there are a range of ways. And so, okay, now that's true. But what happened during apartheid? During apartheid, that idea of cultural relativism was used to justify a whole lot of things. So we don't have to give African people in South Africa psychiatric services because they don't believe in them. We don't have to, and here, this is a true story. The American Psychiatric Association visited South Africa in the late 70s, I think it was about 1977. And they came to the big psychiatric institution in Cape Town, which is called Falkenberg Hospital, which by law was divided by race. So there was the white side and the black side. Okay? It's just hard. Anyway. And they looked at the food that was given to the patients. And they found that the nutritional quality of the food given to black African patients was inferior to the nutritional, this whole thing's about nutrition. You see, I know my audience. The nutritional quality of the food given to the African patients was inferior to that given to white people. I mean, it's outrageous. It's a disgrace. It's a human rights abuse as far as I'm concerned. What was the response of the psychiatric body? I can't remember what it was called, at the Society of Psychiatrists in South Africa at the time. No, the reason we give them different food is that culturally they like different food. So we're protecting their culture by giving them this inferior food. So I give this talk, and one of the professors came up to me, and it's one of those moments which I sort of remember with that sort of clarity. And she said to me, Leslie, that was very good. You know, you should publish it in a journal. I was like 28 years old. I had hair. Anyway, so she said, I said, oh, thank you. She said, where are you going to publish it? And I said, Culture, Medicine and Psychiatry, which was the top journal in the field. Arthur Kleinman at Harvard University had established it. It was the premier journal in the world. And I will never forget, she looked at me and she said, just who do you think you are? You, 20-something years old, standing here in Cape Town, thinking you're going to get into culture, medicine and psychiatry. Send it to the South African Medical Journal, Know Your Place. Well, I'm sure you've all heard that story of knowing your place before, in a whole range of ways. Well, of course, did I? No, I didn't. Now, if the interesting thing is that if I had listened to her, this, you know, she was trying to help me. If I'd listened to her and I'd sent it to South African Medical Journal, I'll tell you two things. Firstly, South African Medical Journal at that time did not accept any articles which didn't have empirical quantitative data. Okay, so they would have rejected it because it was just a story about the politics of psychiatry. Secondly, they wouldn't have liked the politics. It was under apartheid, and I don't think they would have published. It's, you know, to the shame. So what did I do? I sent it to Culture, Medicine, and Psychiatry. You know what happened? I got reviews. They liked it. On the basis of that, one of the reviewers, who did they who knows about culture? They'll ask the editor of Transcultural Psychiatric Research Review, which was the other big journal in the field from Canada. He was one of my reviewers. So he contacted me, said, this is very nice. We publish big articles on transcultural psychiatry. Won't you send me the really big one on South Africa? Big sort of article that we put at the front of our journal. So I did. And then I ended up publishing, in fact, it was so big, it ended up being published in two halves. So the original article in Culture, Medicine, and Psychiatry was published in 1985. You can go and see it. The transcultural psychiatry pieces were in 1985 and the first issue of 1986. Then what happens is, so suddenly I'm out there. Okay? I mean, if I'd sat for the South African Medical Journal, they would have said, no, thank you. And that might have been the end of it. Then what happens, I mean, this is a stroke of luck, but this is how does it happen? The journal then gets relaunched. Transcultural Psychiatry was a journal of reviews as a more conventional journal called Transcultural Psychiatry. And Lawrence Kermeyer is the editor. And Lawrence is sitting in Montreal, and he thinks, oh, this is a journal called Transcultural Psychiatry. We better find some people as associate editors who kind of international, because, you know, the cultural stuff is international. Who do we know? Oh, yeah, no, there was this article recently in here. I think I'll just ask this guy. I mean, he didn't even know me. I became associate editor of Transcultural. That's how I became associate editor. Because, why? Because I wasn't too modest. And that's how I became an editor, and that's how I got interested in all of this. So don't be too modest.